Thought Leadership from PwC's National Office.
Don't be put off by that impression of complexity, because I really think, start engaging with the topic, thinking particularly about the interface with nature, so the kind of baselining of impacts and dependencies is the place to start. Ideally thinking strategically about the topic and about how it also aligns and dovetails with climate goals and ambitions. Those are the places to start.
Hello. Today we're back with an update to our Becoming Nature Positive series, talking about the latest developments at the intersection of business and nature. This is PwC's Accounting Podcast. I'm Heather Horn, and thanks so much for joining us today. If you tuned in to our series last spring on nature and biodiversity, you'll have a foundation on the massive implications that these topics have for business. And even if not, this episode will be a great place to jump in. It's been quite a year for these topics as well, both from a business perspective as well as reporting and standard setting. We thought we'd take some time to take stock of what's been happening in the landscape of nature and business, and to help you make sense of some of the developments, as well as highlight some of what's on the horizon. And of course, given the topic, we cover some key considerations from an interoperability perspective. To do all this, I've asked Will Evison, who leads PwC's Center for Nature Positive Business, to come back to the podcast to break it all down for us. With that, here's my conversation with Will. Will, welcome back to the podcast. So nice to have you on. I think it's about almost exactly a year since we had you last on. And obviously a lot has happened since then from sort of a business and nature perspective, both thinking about issues as well as reporting. And even, you and I were chatting before the podcast, and I asked you, you said you've been very busy with client work. And I said, well, so reporting or actually strategy? And you said both. So definitely it coincides there. But perhaps before we kick things off today, I think it would be really helpful to talk about, just as a quick recap, about PwC's Center for Nature Positive Business that we launched last year, and just why we did it, and kind of, again, sort of level set.
Yeah, great. And thanks, Heather, for having me back on. It's great to be back. So yeah, we launched our Center for Nature Positive Business just over a year ago. And we did that really as a big part of PwC's response to the nature crisis. Clearly, there's a lot we can do in our own operations, in our supply chain, and the team are doing great work on that. But a key part of our impact on nature as an organization relates to the advice and the services that we offer. And that's where we're focused with our global center. And we've been busy, it's fair to say. So we hired a brilliant executive director, Lucas Carmody, who's based in Australia. We've built a central global team of experts who cover biodiversity and ecosystems. They cover water, pollution, waste, really all the topics that we see coming into the nature agenda. We've also been scaling up our teams in many of the territories where we're delivering a lot of nature-related work. So really notably in Japan and in the Middle East, there's big teams in those areas now. We've been developing our offering. So in PwC speak, we have our integrated solution, which is really how we deliver services to our clients, from initial baselining through strategy, through helping them with target setting around nature, and then implementation and reporting. So we've really been building out that offering, the way we support organizations. As part of that, we've been building out our digital offering, our digital accelerators, which really make nature-related data accessible to our clients. Nature is often seen as actually a big data problem for organizations and a big data challenge. But there's so much technology, so much data out there now that's available to support companies. And so we've obviously been working on that quite a lot. We made 3 big sort of bold commitments to initiatives as well this year. So some of the external initiatives that are shaping the frameworks that are designed to help enable this, what we talk about as the nature positive transition. And I talked about that last time we were on. This is the sort of corollary to the net zero transition for climate change, the nature positive transition. It's a bit harder to pin down and define, but there are a bunch of great initiatives out there helping to do that. So we'll talk a bit more about those as we get into it. But the three things we've really kind of put a lot of effort into supporting are science-based targets for nature. We've had some great secondees over there supporting with their first set of target setting for 17 companies. We were founding members of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. I know we'll talk a bit more about that today, I'm sure. To TNFD. So again, we've had people supporting TNFD, and particularly we run something called the Nature-Related Data Catalyst. I mentioned about digital accelerators. That's really linked to that. And lastly, we've been supporting a group called Business for Nature. Brilliant little NGO who were really influential in the last biodiversity COP in Montreal in getting particularly the business goal agreed. They're really a positive voice for business around nature. We've been supporting them with something called the It's Now for Nature campaign. So this is a campaign really getting companies to engage with the topic of nature, particularly by starting by setting nature strategies. So we wrote something called the Nature Strategies Handbook with Business for Nature, and that's a great reference point.
All right. Well, definitely we will include some links to that in the show notes. It's interesting, though, because it's, listening to all of these initiatives, and I know there are a lot of companies very focused on it. But as I mentioned to you briefly before we started, I still think for many companies, you have climate is up there on the agenda, and then sort of all other topics. And so how are you seeing the reaction to things like this handbook that you've done with Business for Nature? Otherwise, are you seeing companies movement in terms of how companies are incorporating this in their agenda? Or is it still, some companies have gotten it, but there's still a lot of work to do?
Yeah, I think that sums it up really well. I think, there's a group of companies who've been focused on this topic for some time. And there are particular sectors who really they've been required to understand their impacts and dependencies on nature for a long time. So you take the mining sector, because they have quite visible and direct impacts on biodiversity. They, as a sector, are one of the most advanced, and they've been focused on this agenda for a long time. But then you've got and I think similarly, sort of forestry companies, other kind of primary resources companies are often the more advanced on this agenda. I think where it gets much more challenging and complex is when it relates to the value chains, often the supply chains of companies. You've got big agricultural supply chains in particular. And some of those organizations are certainly in the vanguard at the forefront, developing really impressive integrated climate and nature strategies, and really thinking through the issues and putting in place programs to respond. There's a huge number of companies that just haven't really engaged meaningfully with the topic. And for those companies, we're seeing the compliance requirements, which I know we'll talk more about, the sort of compliance related reporting requirements, really pushing them in the direction of thinking about these topics first. Now, some of those companies are then using that as a spur to think really strategically about these issues, rather than just trying to tick all the boxes that are required by the regulation. So even then, there's a mix of the way companies are coming at those requirements.
It's very interesting you say that, because I recently had Nadia Picard on talking about the first CSRD survey that we had completed, and I highly recommend that episode for anyone who's interested. But she mentioned one of the findings from the survey was that, I think I'll get the stat wrong, but it's something around 75 or 80% of companies actually are seeing that preparing for CSRD, adoption of CSRD is impacting their strategy. And so it sounds like you're seeing that as well. There is some people who are just viewing it as compliance, but more likely once they start to dig into it, then you start to think about strategy.
Yeah, 100%. I've been working, as you know, in this sort of sustainability consulting strategy space for the last 20 years. CSRD is without question the biggest thing to happen in the history of corporate sustainability. It might be the biggest thing ever to happen, right? It is a transformative agenda, not as many people see it, a reporting agenda. And actually, I work with lots of companies on CSRD and particularly around E4, the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Standard. And what we're seeing is the number of groups within those organizations who are engaged now in the topic because of CSRD is, grown and multiplied, right? So we're dealing with risk teams, strategy teams, procurement teams, you name it, really. Pretty much every team within an organization is now brought into the scope of thinking about those topics, which is, that is a transformation from even relatively recently.
Yeah, again, I'll quote a stat from that survey. I think on average, 8 groups, which means obviously some are lower, but some are definitely higher. But let me ask you a question, because we will get into reporting, but I think it's also important to level set why this is still important or why this is important. So from your perspective, people can check out those old episodes from last year, but I still think it's an important reminder here.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think one of the big stats that really sticks in my mind is that we have lost 70% of monitored wildlife populations in the last 50 years. So, that's based on monitoring of 32,000 wildlife populations.
That's a huge number.
It's a terrifying statistic, right? I don't think of myself as super old, but we've lost 50% since I was born, which is, again, scary to think about.
Yeah.
We did a piece of work a few years ago with the World Economic Forum called Nature Risk Rising, and we actually refreshed the sort of underlying economic analysis for that when we launched our center last year. And people can find that. We'll pop a link in, but it's called Managing Nature Risk. And in that analysis, we found that 55% of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. And we looked at the stock markets all around the world. We found more than half of the market cap of the 19 biggest stock exchanges in the world is highly or moderately dependent on nature. So that gives you a sense of the kind of materiality of this topic to corporate value chains. That's, so those for me, those two kind of bits of information, the scale of the declines in nature and biodiversity, and then the scale of the dependence of our economy on the services that nature and biodiversity provides. Those two factors explain, hopefully, why this is a material topic.
Yeah. So obviously a lot for companies to think about. And I think, again, if you just take a step back and you think of those staggering statistics, it's hard then from a corporate perspective for people to say, okay, this doesn't matter. Combined with the fact that now we do have this changing reporting landscape. So we'll talk a bit about E4. However, I do think it's important to also talk about the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD. We did have Dan O'Brien on last year and released an episode in October that people can check out. But again, what does that development mean from a nature reporting perspective?
Yeah, it's a really big development. So formally launched in September last year. The TNFD follows quite closely. It's the forerunner, which was the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And I think it's worth noting, many of your listeners will be aware, the TCFD recommendations have now been subsumed into ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. So the TNFD is structured around those same 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And it provides a really comprehensive framework for risk management and disclosure around all those environmental topics beyond carbon. So land use, pollution, water, waste, plastics, as well as the kind of state of nature related metrics. And it really asks companies to assess their impacts, but also importantly, their dependencies on nature, and then to think about what are the associated risks and opportunities. And as with TCFD, there's also a big focus on the both the environmental and the financial consequences. So what it means for strategy and business model, business planning, etc.
So if I'm a company then that's subject to CSRD and I'm thinking about E4, does that mean TNFD is just sort of to the side, or how do I think about this? And we're going to talk about a lot of other standards too. But
for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. It is and very topical because TNFD have just today, TNFD and FRAG have just published their sort of correspondence table, the really detailed read across between the two. But essentially what they conclude is that the two are, highly aligned. Obviously they were working together in the development in parallel, a lot in parallel. So it's interesting as well, what we're seeing is some CSRD reporters have concluded, well, I'll have covered virtually everything in TNFD if I report according to CSRD E2 to 5. Therefore, I might as well become an early adopter of TNFD as well. So you'll see some CSRD Wave 1, Wave 2 companies who have become TNFD early adopters as well. And as I should have mentioned, there's now, I think, very close to, or maybe more than 400 TNFD early adopters. There's going to be some more announced at London Climate Action Week. Really good uptake, considering that is a voluntary framework.
Yes, and just launched in September of last year, as you said, so not even a year ago.
I know, it's been remarkably successful, and I hope will be remarkably impactful.
But so then you mentioned the fact, and I think our listeners would be aware that TCFD was subsumed into the ISSB. We saw in April that as part of the result of its agenda consultation, the ISSB announced its research project on biodiversity ecosystems and ecosystem services. And so again, how does that fit into this landscape?
Yeah. I think it's a really significant and really helpful development. It's a really important signal. Obviously, lots of countries that are outside of the EU have kind of said, well, we'll ultimately be aligning with what the ISSB recommends. So it really sets the direction of travel. TNFD is working very closely with the ISSB. I think it's fair to say there's a pretty strong expectation that the ISSB will incorporate something that looks a great deal like TNFD over time. And I think it provides, hopefully, real confidence to the early adopters. Like I said, now, 400 odd companies, that is the direction of travel, and that is therefore a really useful framework to align with.
So then I know there's also other developments, because if we again sort of think about all these standard setters out there, we also have that GRI officially launched their biodiversity standards, so GRI 304, and CDP announced last September that they'd be aligning with the TNFD framework. Obviously, we did see them also align with IFRS S2, so the climate standard there, which I think has been really viewed as a positive from an uptake of the ISSB standards as well. And as countries are thinking about that, an important point. And I know that their 2024 questionnaire already includes some biodiversity. So again, there's a lot of developments, a lot of different resources for companies. So how do you sort of line all this up in your own mind?
Yeah, I mean, when you summarize it like that, it feels tricky, doesn't it? I think I take heart from the ISSB announcement and generally this the extent to which these organizations are now working together, and that actually what we're seeing is after a period of divergence is a period of convergence. There really is convergence. I think the TNFD amongst all of that is probably the clearest direction of travel around reporting if you're outside of CSRD. And as I said, CSRD is also closely aligned with TNFD and refers out to it a lot. I think taking a real quick step back from reporting, though, when we talk to organizations that are starting to think about this and maybe aren't captured immediately by compliance requirements, or indeed some that are, the place we recommend to start is with nature-related baselining, so impact and dependency assessment across the value chain to really understand the interface with nature. And then we encourage organizations to think about strategy. And I mentioned in the intro, we developed something with a group called Business for Nature as the knowledge partners for their campaign. It's now for nature, called the Nature Strategy Handbook. And one of the things people in feedback say they like about the Nature Strategy Handbook is it's really short. And it's really simple, and it's a very accessible guide to for an organization that's pretty new to the space to think about the relevance of nature to their organization, and then think about how they might start to build it into their processes, how they might start to think about it. So structured around 4 parts: assess, commit, transform, and disclose. And they are very much what they sound like. It's very kind of step-by-step guide. So that is also, if we take a step out of all these reporting requirements and the old kind of alphabet soup analogy, actually thinking from a more strategic point of view can be a really good place to start.
Yeah, so that leads a question then, because a lot of our listeners will be coming from the financial reporting background. And again, if I compare to climate's extremely complicated. However, there are a few metrics most people with some brief introduction can get their head around. Greenhouse gas emissions, you want less. And then, there's 3 types of greenhouse gas emissions companies think about. Again, it's pretty easy to get your head around those 3 different scopes. I think for companies reading, again, if I'm a controller or someone else reading a nature standard, it's less familiar. And again, we talked about this last year, but I think what is your sort of runway for that person of how much they need to understand? Or is this really still something, we'll leave it to your sustainability and risk people, you can just get the information from them?
It's a really good question. Working back in the sort of early days of assessing climate-related impact, it's really heartening that people now talk about climate as being simple.
Well, and I didn't mean to say it was simple, but relatively,
in common with everyone else, actually, we've got to grips with a lot of the complexity, and therefore it feels more familiar and more simple. And I think we're just, I would say that we're just at the early stages, similarly with nature. Now, there are some basic starting points that I think are really, really helpful. So the TNFD global core metrics, those are the metrics that they think pretty much any organization could and should be capturing around nature. They're a really great place to start. There's just 10 of them.
Manageable.
So it's a sort of manageable number, and they're designed to be as accessible as possible. So they may be things that organizations haven't yet captured or haven't yet consolidated, but they should be capturable, if that makes sense. So things like the total land footprint. It's a really important piece of information if you're going to start thinking about what's my impact, particularly my direct impact on nature. It's not normally something that all organizations are capturing and consolidating at the moment, but it's manageable to obtain. And you start by thinking about that in your own operations. And then certainly it can be a bit more complicated to estimate that if you've got a big, complicated agricultural supply chain. But as a starting point, and there's a bunch of estimation techniques, very similar to the kind of estimation techniques we use to estimate Scope 3 supply chain climate emissions. In fact, some of them, some of the models that we use, it's exactly the same underlying model that we use to estimate carbon emissions that we use to estimate land footprint or pollution or waste or plastics. You do that kind of estimation initially for your baselining, and then you home in on the areas where you might need to get real data, much like companies are doing for their Scope 3 emissions.
All right, that's definitely a helpful point. So, and then with that, maybe it's a good segue to talk about some of the work you are doing with companies and sort of this combination of strategy and reporting. I know, we talked already, we've mentioned ESRS E4, but just how is this all fitting together, and what are some of the key things companies are looking at?
Yeah. We did talk about it a little bit already, and I don't want to sort of recap too much, but at a kind of big picture, we're seeing organizations needing a lot of help with the environmental standards under CSRD, and particularly E2 to E5, which are less familiar. So that for those who aren't super familiar, sorry to quote all the numbers, but that's pollution, that's water, that's ecosystems and biodiversity, and that's waste and circularity. And we're finding those more complex and novel areas, organizations need more support. One example of one of the things that listeners might be interested in. So under CSRD, there's something called biodiversity sensitive areas assessment as part of E4. And one of the things that has been surprising quite a lot of the companies we work with is the fact that that requirement is independent of materiality. So even if you conclude that E4, the biodiversity standard, is not material to your organization, you still need to have done this biodiversity sensitive areas assessment. Biodiversity sensitive areas assessment sounds relatively simple. You need to identify if any of your own operational sites are in or adjacent to biodiversity sensitive areas, which basically means protected areas or key biodiversity areas, which are areas important for biodiversity, but outside of protected areas in some cases. Now, that sounds kind of simple. Actually, what we find is if you're an organization with more than a handful of sites, it can be very, very complicated. Just as a sort of case in point, there are more than 100,000 different protected areas within the EU. There are more than 15 protected area designations within the EU, and they're all changing all the time. And of course, as a dynamic organization, where your sites are is also changing over time. So this is an annual requirement, and we're finding that lots of organizations finding it quite tricky to do what feels like a basic requirement under that. This is where I come back to the sort of digital tools and data. That's an area where we've just partnered with an organization to offer that as a very simple packaged service to do that biodiversity sensitive areas assessment. There's clearly a great deal more to E4 than that assessment, but that actually is one of the earliest starting points that quite a few organizations are going with.
Well, and I definitely think this point about the fact that it's not about materiality, because I think for most people, they're so focused on double materiality assessment, identifying their impacts, risks, opportunities, IROs, that they haven't even gotten to the fact that, okay, well, some of this data you may need anyway. And so it's a key point. You don't want to be dealing with your biosensitive areas in December if you're reporting in February. So
exactly. And you need to be able to make that declaration.
Yeah. So then how does, you mentioned all the regulations changing. I know there's the EU deforestation regulation. How does that fit in then as some companies are thinking about their E4 compliance?
Yeah. I mean, it's another really interesting and remarkable piece of legislation. So for those who aren't familiar, EU deforestation regulation applies to a series of high deforestation risk commodities. So things like cocoa and coffee, but also soy, timber, pulp and paper, anything to do with cattle, and the derivatives of those things. And it places some pretty stringent requirements on organizations that either bring those things into the EU or take them out of the EU. And it requires companies to be able to trace, ultimately requires companies to be able to trace those materials right back to the parcel of land that they come from. Now, many of those commodities, your listeners will be familiar, they're traded in pretty complex supply chains, often multiple points of aggregation in those supply chains. So it's really not the way that those supply chains are set up to work at the moment. Very few organizations have the degree of traceability that's required by the regulation. So it is really, in part, trying to upend the way that some of those supply chains, some of those value chains work. And companies have to be able to make a formal declaration, due diligence declaration, saying that essentially they know where their stuff is coming from and that it hasn't been associated with any deforestation since 2020. Now, that's relatively recently, but it still requires you to know exactly where it's coming from and exactly what's been happening in those places. So it's complex and very acute challenge for some organizations at the moment.
Yes. And for our listeners' benefit, I am working on a podcast on this regulation. So hopefully more to come in the next few months on that. Will, I guess on that sort of similar note, what other things on the horizon would you recommend that people be looking for? I know we have COP16 coming up in October, but what else, do you see companies needing to focus on right now in this area?
Yeah, well, so there's a few things happening. So we talked a lot about CSRD, about EU deforestation regulation. Those, I think, are two of the really big drivers, and companies rightly be focused on a lot on those. We talked a bit about TNFD early adopters. There's more and more adopters coming on stream, more announcements soon. The science-based targets for nature, they're now opening up their process to more companies. So more companies can now set targets for freshwater and for land. It's an exciting development. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development and actually the World Economic Forum and Business for Nature are all working on sectoral roadmaps to nature positive. So basically describing the roadmaps for how organizations within any given sector can transition their organizations towards nature positive. We're working on one with WBCSD for the pharmaceutical sector at the moment, really interesting sector for its nature impact. But the big thing on the horizon, you mentioned, the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties, number 16. So that's COP16, the other COP. And that's in Cali in Colombia this year. Again, we're expecting a lot of organizations to be represented there, the kind of businesses and financial institutions who are engaged on nature-related topics. The agenda is fairly ambitious. There's a big agenda around financing and closing the financing gap for nature. There's work to be done on the mechanism around access and benefit sharing, and particularly digital sequence information. So that has really big implications for sort of crop science sectors and pharmaceutical sectors. And then there's big pressure on companies to update their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or NBSAP. So these are the kind of implementation mechanisms for the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is, of course, the framework for nature positive that was agreed in Montreal at the very end of 2022. So that's a bit of an outline of what's coming up. I'm sure I've missed lots of things as well.
Well, it sounds like I'm going to need to have you back on in the fall to give us an update on all these developments. In the meantime, final words of wisdom for companies that are trying to grapple with all of this change, the regulatory environment, what would you say?
I think don't be put off by that impression of complexity, because I really think, start engaging with the topic, thinking particularly about the interface with nature. So the kind of baselining of impacts and dependencies is the place to start. Ideally thinking, strategically about the topic and about how it also aligns and dovetails with climate goals and ambitions. Those are the places to start.
All right. Well, Will, as always, such a pleasure to talk to you. And I am planning to have you back in the fall. So audience, you can look forward to that. Thanks again for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Heather. Great to be with you.
That's our show for today. Tune in next week for more fresh episodes. So that you never miss any of our audio content, follow the PwC Accounting Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And to stay up to date on all our latest accounting and reporting news, sign up for our newsletter at viewpoint.pwc.com. From Thought Leadership at PwC, I'm Heather Horn. Thanks for tuning in.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates, and they sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors, including accountants and lawyers.